Mimi Mwai Kibaki naapa kwamba nitatenda kazi zangu za urais kwa Jamhuri ya Kenya kwa uaminifu na kutimiza wajibu wa kazi hizo kwa bidii na kwa moyo mkunjufu, na kwamba nitawatendea haki watu wote wa mujibu wa sheria, mila na desturi za Jamhuri ya Kenya bila uoga, upendeleo, huba wala chuki. Ewe Mwenyezi Mungu unisaidie.
On the night of December 30th, 2007, Kenya didn't just go tense. It went uncertain. The kind of uncertainty that makes a whole country hold its breath and think, are we really about to do this again? Because by then, Kenyans had voted. The ballots had been cast. Polling stations had counted results. And yet, still, somewhere between the numbers on the ground and the announcement in Nairobi, Kenya's election stopped feeling like democracy and started feeling like a decision. This is the story of the 2007 election and the violence that followed. One of the darkest chapters in modern Kenyan history. A story of alleged pressure, institutional collapse, disputed tallies, and a national trauma that would leave more than 1,000 people dead and hundreds of thousands displaced. And because this is the Black Archive, we are not here for slogans. We're here for how it happened, who was in the room, what was alleged, what investigators later found, and why so many Kenyans walked away believing the truth had been buried. In 2007, Kenya wasn't calm. It was restless. President Mwai Kibaki was seeking re-election. Opposition leader Raila Odinga was running on a wave of anger over corruption, inequality, and a sense that the promises of the early 2000s had been swallowed by the political class. Turnout was high. The mood was intense, but hopeful. Many people genuinely believed, this one matters. And early on, what Kenyans saw on television looked like an election doing what it's supposed to do. Votes counted, results coming in. A nation watched it had to be processed on the reset of developing the numbers of the wealth and the scores of white people. But then, the story moved from polling stations to the National Tallying Center, and that's where the process began to break. As constituency results came in, multiple tallies showed Raila Odinga leading. And then, delays, confusion, revisions, allegations that results were being changed, or arriving with missing documents, or being announced in ways that didn't match the paperwork expected in a credible tally. This is the moment Kenya's election stopped feeling like arithmetic and started feeling like a negotiation. At the center of this was the Electoral Commission of Kenya, the ECK, led by Chairman Samuel Kivuitu. Days later, Kivuitu would make a statement that detonated public trust. He said he announced results under pressure and, most explosively, he said he did not know whether Kibaki had actually won. Let that sit for a second. The man announcing the winner publicly admitting he wasn't sure who won. And this wasn't just gossip, it was widely reported at the time and later referenced again as part of the larger crisis narrative. Controversy piled on top of controversy. There were reports and later testimony suggesting that observers and journalists were pushed out of the tallying center, and that security presence and political pressure increased as the final announcement approached. Kenya wasn't just watching an election. It was watching an institution buckle. In the final hours, the tallying center became a fortress. And then the announcement came. Kibaki was declared the winner.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the law says that the Electoral Commission must identify the person who is to be sworn as a president because a fake one might come. And it also provides for a certificate to be given. And so I've got a certificate here which I don't know the procedure, whether I should take it there. It reads Certificate of Results of Presidential Election. The Electoral Commission of Kenya certifies that the candidate who has been duly elected the President of the Republic of Kenya under the provisions of Section 5 of the Constitution in the presidential elections held on 27th December 2007 is Honorable Mwai Kibaki.
The country reacted like a match had been thrown in the final minute. And within a very short time, before a meaningful verification process could settle the dispute, Kibaki was sworn in. Fast, heavily guarded, a ceremony that many Kenyans interpreted as not just a swearing in, but a message. This is done. There will be no debate. That speed, paired with a process already under a cloud, pushed the country over the edge. What happened next is often described as post-election violence, as if it was a natural disaster, as if violence simply broke out, like Wayne. But reports from human rights organizations describe patterns that look less like chaos and more like organization, political mobilization, targeted attacks, revenge cycles, and security forces responding with deadly force in some areas. Kenya began to split along political and ethnic lines. People were dragged from vehicles, homes were burned, businesses were looted, families fled with whatever they could carry. And then came one of the most infamous images of that period, Kiamba Church, near Eldoret, where people who thought they had found shelter were attacked. The church was burned on January 1, 2008. International reporting at the time described bodies recovered and estimates of around dozens killed, including women and children. ICC-related records later referenced the Kiamba church attack as a significant incident in the broader post-election violence narrative. This is the kind of event that changes a country permanently. Because after Kiamba, the violence wasn't abstract anymore. It had a smell, it had faces, it had names. In places like Kisumu and Nairobi, protests and riots erupted. And one of the major controversies, still deeply bitter today, is the role of the police. Human rights reporting and later summaries of the post-election violence narrative. This is the kind of event that changes a country permanently. Because after Kiamba, the violence wasn't abstract anymore. It had a smell, it had faces, it had names. In places like Kisumu and Nairobi, protests and riots erupted. And one of the major controversies, still deeply bitter today, is the role of the police. Human rights reporting and later summaries of official findings describe police responses that were, in many instances, lethal. According to reporting on the Waki Commission's findings, hundreds of people were shot dead by police, with the figure 405 repeatedly cited in connection with those findings. Legal filings and advocacy summaries have also referenced the same figure and alleged large numbers of additional people shot and wounded. That's not a footnote. That's a major part of the story. Because it's one thing to say Kenyans fought, it's another to confront the claim that state force contributed massively to the death toll. As violence moved and mutated, it became a cycle: attack, counterattack, reprisal. The crew saw major clashes. Naivasha became a symbol of retaliation. And one of the ugliest controversies of that period involves allegations around the Mungiki sect and retaliatory attacks in Rift Valley towns. Claims that have surfaced in multiple reports and retrospective accounts, including major Kenyan media reporting. The deeper tragedy is that, by this point, it wasn't politicians fighting. It was ordinary people paying the price for a lead conflict. Kenya Red Cross situation updates from the time described escalating displacement and humanitarian strain as the violence unfolded. And the numbers became national trauma. Human Rights Watch later cited 1,133 or more killings during the period and criticized the lack of accountability afterward. Other sources commonly cite death toll estimates in a similar range and displacement in the hundreds of thousands. People weren't just dying. They were being uprooted, entire communities displaced, homes destroyed, and lives reset to zero. When Kenya was on the brink, Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan led mediation that produced a power-sharing deal. Kibaki remained president, Raila became prime minister. The violence slowed, but the truth didn't arrive. Instead, Kenya moved into the next phase: commissions, reports, and a quiet war over accountability. One major finding from the election review, often linked to the Kriegler Commission, was that the election process was so seriously flawed that it was not possible to determine a definitive winner with confidence. In other words, Kenya didn't get a clean conclusion. It got a political settlement. And that is one reason the wound never healed. When domestic accountability fails to convince the public, the issue escalated internationally. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation into the post-election violence. And this is where players enter the story in a way that is very specific and very sensitive. The ICC prosecutor named several high-profile individuals as suspects, often remembered as the Ocampo Six. These included Uhuru Kenyatta, the current president William Ruto, Joshua Arap Son, Francis Mufara, Henry Kazge, and Mohammed Hussein Ali, with allegations tied to crimes against humanity connected to the violence. Important, these were allegations and prosecutions, not proven guilt in court. Over time, some charges were not confirmed, some were withdrawn, and the remaining cases collapsed or were vacated, dismissed. By 2016, reporting and human rights commentary widely noted that all the major cases had fallen apart, raising further controversy over witness interference claims, political pressure, and the limits of international justice. So Kenya ended up with a devastating outcome. A crisis so big it reached The Hague, and still, for most victims, no closure. The 2007 election taught Kenyan politics a lesson that may be the darkest of all. That institutions can fail, that truth can be disputed into irrelevance, and that stability can become the excuse that replaces justice. Human rights groups later accused the state of failing to prosecute perpetrators meaningfully and leaving victims, especially of sexual violence and displacement, without effective justice or reparations. And that is why when you ask some Kenyans today about elections, they don't talk about manifestos. They talk about 2007. They talk about fear. They talk about displacement. They talk about how quickly things can turn. Because once a country watches an election collapse into bloodshed, it never unlearns that memory. The 2007 election was not just a disputed result. It was a national fracture. It was a lesson in how fragile democracy is when institutions bend under pressure and when political competition is allowed to become ethnic warfare. And it left Kenya with a question that still hangs in the air. If a country cannot agree on what happened, how can it ever truly move on? This is the Blatt Archives. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share, because the next file is already waiting.